So hello and welcome to the next in the series of the AI and Democracy webinars hosted by the Democracy Network and myself as founder of Anti-Party. So the Democracy Network works to strengthen the relationships and connections between organizations, projects, and individuals working to build a healthier democracy in the UK. The network is open to all working in or around issues of democracy, power, and voice in the UK. Meanwhile, Anti-Party is a pro-democracy movement born from the Partygate scandal, lest we forget, looking to transcend the two-party system by applying collective intelligence for systems change. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our main speaker for today's session, Flynn Devine, a participation practitioner and researcher who has just started his new role as AI and collective intelligence research lead at the Collective Intelligence Project. He's previously collaborated with organizations in over 50 countries and worked directly with government, civil society, and industry. He was in the founding team for Iswe Foundation, designed and delivered the first ever Global Citizens Assembly, and has been part of the Alan Turing Institute's public policy program. Flynn recently received a grant from OpenAI as an independent researcher to help design democratic inputs into AI, utilizing collective intelligence for AI development. In collaboration with Chatham House, vTaiwan, and the AI Objective Institute, the Recursive Public, the name of the project, has been built on the methodology developed by vTaiwan over the last decade, and with the assistance of AI, aim to build the idea of recursion. So this process utilizes a mix of digital and face-to-face processes to convene diverse groups from across demographic, geographical, and contextual backgrounds to answer key questions around AI. So at the end of the presentation, we will open up for questions and discussion, but if anyone has any burning questions, urgent clarification points, please raise your hand throughout the presentation and we'll be more than happy to take them. And this is meant to be an engaging, lively discussion, not a lecture. So please just speak up whenever you feel the call. This is a democratic space after all. So now it's my pleasure to hand over to Flynn to take it away. Thanks so much, Flynn.
Brilliant, thanks so much. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming. So as Isabel mentioned, I work for an organization called the Collective Intelligence Project. And generally, the focus of my work is thinking about how we can utilize kind of collective intelligence systems and processes to overcome some of the very kind of tricky and interesting questions that arise from developing and deploying artificial intelligence. And so I've got a bit of a presentation. It's not a lecture, I promise. It definitely won't take the whole hour. It's kind of reasonably short. And then I'd love to kind of just open up to a discussion and hear all of your thinking. So without further ado, I will share my screen and go ahead if my computer decides to do it. Awesome. So utilizing collective intelligence in AI is, kind of the overarching theme. And within this, I'm going to talk about a bit about the work of the Collective Intelligence Project and a bit about the Recursive Public, which, as Isabella mentioned, is this project that OpenAI funded me to run over a couple of months. And then generally talk a bit about kind of some of the learnings I've had from doing this work over the last kind of 6 months primarily. Some of the things that I'm thinking about moving forward, and then we can definitely open it up to kind of questions and discussion would be really cool. So why kind of do this work in the first place? I mean, this is kind of, I think, the key kind of problem statement that we face, that we have no systemized or robust ways for the majority of people affected to impact AI related decisions. And I think this is quite a big issue for multiple reasons, and I think there's multiple reasons why we would want to use collective intelligence systems when thinking about AI. So number one is that there is very few people making decisions that affect billions, as we see kind of from the rise of generative AI tools, specifically things like ChatGPT, DALL-E, and all of these other tools coming from these labs. Billions of people now are using these tools. And I think more and more AI is going to become a part of our lives, and there's very few people at the moment kind of making key decisions and design choices about what those tools look like. Number two, they don't have the full information on how AI affects society, because no individual or small group does. Number three, giving people agency over technology is democratic, which I think personally is, a good thing. And number four, building human values into AI requires us thinking about how to engage people and actually like how to elicit values, like what are values, universal values versus context specific things. I think the important point here is that a lot of the interesting problems, but also kind of tricky problems that arise from AI really are quite value based. And so it's important to think about how we can utilize collective intelligence processes to kind of figure out what values, should be the answers to those problems. And just, for an example here, ChatGPT, which was a large language model, chat interface released by OpenAI, was the fastest growing consumer product in history. So these issues need answering because these questions, have real implications, and those have real implications in the world and in people's lives. So the work that I'm thinking about at the moment is, really trying to catch the now, to embed these practices into the way we think about developing technology as we move forward. So I'm going to start a bit talking about the work of the Collective Intelligence Project. This organization's only around a year old, but I'm really, really excited to join and kind of take over some work there, because I think, especially for an organization so young, they've really done some amazing work, and they have a presence at the AI Safety Summit happening in Bletchley Park at the moment, the AI Fringe, and other things. So the part of work that I'm focusing on at CIP is what we're calling alignment assemblies. And really at its core, this is thinking, how do we take relevant publics and design processes that enable kind of useful input into key decisions on AI? And just for example, in the last year, here's some of the kind of process partners and assembly partners that we have already had. So process partners like MODA, which is the Taiwan Ministry of Digital Affairs, led by Audrey Tang, who some of you might be aware of, kind of one of the pioneers of the vTaiwan kind of community and process, the GovLab and others. And in terms of assembly partners, we've already kind of run or facilitated or supported processes with OpenAI, Anthropic, who are another big AI lab based in the Bay Area of California, and also the Creative Commons Foundation. And for a bit of a peek about what some of those work streams look like, here's just 4 that's been worked on in the last year. So our collaboration with OpenAI was focusing on democratizing risk assessments. So this really posed the question about, what does the US public want to measure and mitigate when it comes to LLM, is a large language model. So when it comes to large language model risks and harm, so looking at how we can kind of incorporate these into those auditing processes. The collaboration with MODA was kind of looking at the Taiwan government's approach to response more widely. The collaboration with Anthropic was looking at, actually, could we use collective intelligence processes to help guide the behavior of these large language models? And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And with the Creative Commons Foundation, it was looking at what should the Creative Commons response be when these kind of openly licensed artworks and kind of other artistic outputs are being used in AI training models. And CIP also played a big role, really, in kind of inspiring OpenAI to do their democratic inputs to AI grant scheme, which, as Isabella mentioned, is actually the grant scheme that funded the Recursive Public, which is the project I'll talk about briefly next. And so they've also kind of, played quite a key role, I think, in steering this conversation so far. And so what does this really look like in practice? It's all good and well saying we should have democratic processes, participatory practices in AI development, but what does that really look like? And so here is just a short list of the kind of possible aspects of AI development that we think it would be really interesting to experiment with, and we've already done some experiments with. So to list a few, kind of looking at evaluations and audits. So how do we evaluate models, for example, when something like ChatGPT comes out? Companies have to spend a lot of time kind of evaluating them, seeing what behaviors they elicit, do they give useful outputs, etc. But also there, we need to think about possible risks it might pose. And so what would it look like to kind of incorporate multiple publics in those conversations? Another one might be looking at training data. So this is things like the work with Creative Commons. What does it mean if we have kind of participatory governance over deciding what should be used and not be used as training data for these models? Or, what kind of, should people be paid if their art is being used in generative models, etc. There's also things about policy, things about trust and safety, transparency, and all of these different aspects. And so just to give kind of an example of one, the work we did that happened with OpenAI really was looking at this question of kind of auditing and evaluations. And so it posed a question looking at what would the American public want to evaluate and mitigate when it comes to large language model behavior. So this process used a representative sample of 1,000 people in the US, and it used a kind of hybrid methodology that kind of mixed the use of an online participation platform called All Our Ideas and a kind of follow-up face-to-face deep dive deliberation. And just to kind of give a snapshot of the kind of things that are coming out of these processes already. So kind of the number one takeaway from that work is that people actually mostly cared about just really focusing on building good governance infrastructures into these processes, rather than necessarily analyzing specific risks, which I think just goes to show that people already maybe have a bit of uncertainty or don't have full trust in the kind of governance systems that are within these kind of AI labs, which at the end of the day are private entities. And so as you can see kind of there as well, the second highest ranked statement was sufficient regulations are installed to make sure this source is positive for society. So people really think that, we need regulation, we need infrastructure, we need oversight to make sure that kind of the products, the tools being released by these labs are kind of for the public good and aren't going to be harmful. And as you can see there, kind of highlighted in red, the lowest ranked statement was get rid of regulations and disclaimers and just let it run wild. So as you can see from this kind of chart on the left, generally there is a big leaning towards oversight, kind of making sure there's regulatory frameworks in place and very much, against just letting it do its own thing. And just the second biggest takeaway was that we must aim to avoid over-reliance without understanding. So a big challenge we're facing at the moment with lots of these, what are sometimes called kind of foundation models, is that generally they're a bit of a black box. Even the people developing some of these tools don't always fully understand why they're kind of exhibiting behaviors they are, or why they can elicit certain responses or not others. And so as you can see here, the kind of highest ranked statement in this category was, I want to make sure people understand fully what they are and how they work. Over-reliance on something they don't understand is a huge concern. And this was kind of followed up when it moved to a kind of face-to-face roundtable where people were basically saying, we're especially worried as governments take this on more, as big institutions take this on more, and more key decisions being made by these tools. We don't want to get to a place where vital decisions being made and we don't understand why they are. And this is kind of a big debate in the AI space about kind of transparency, accountability, and all these other factors. And so there was kind of, it was really interesting seeing all of the outputs from this. And there's going to be a kind of a piece published very soon kind of talking about this process in detail, but just for a highlight of some of the recommendations that came from this process towards OpenAI were, to monitor post-deployment effects. So this is not just thinking about things before you release the model, but really making sure you keep an eye on how it's behaving once it's out there, how it's being used, how it's affecting people, etc. Make sure that we're incorporating these kind of over-reliance related evaluations into models at the beginning. So do we think this tool is going to create an over-reliance, and especially an over-reliance with a kind of a lack of transparency or understanding? And as you can see, the kind of list goes on, making usage policies transparent. A lot of it's about oversight, about governance, about kind of trustworthiness in these companies and therefore in the tools that they develop. And, just a quick example, another one, this kind of prompted behavior. So recently they did some work with Anthropic, which are another big AI lab coming from California. It was started by a few folks who kind of left OpenAI and started their own lab. This again used a representative sample of 1,000 US folks, but this was just a digital consultation using the tool Polis. And the kind of link you've seen at the bottom is, I'm not going to share loads of slides on this, but they've just, CIP and Anthropic have released blogs kind of explaining this. So if you kind of type in the following, or maybe these slides will be shared afterwards, that's a blog by Anthropic. Or if you just type in Anthropic collects intelligence, the blog will come up that really looks at what we happen. So just for a kind of quick oversight, another example of how we might incorporate this is kind of the process with OpenAI was more about policies for companies, whereas this was really looking at how do we train language models with kind of collective input. So Anthropic are quite well known for a type of large language model and a type of kind of chat interface that they call constitutional AI. So this means that the behavior of the kind of AI is guided by a constitution. So this constitution that Anthropic developed, they pulled from different sources, including, kind of the UN Declaration of Human Rights and other places. And this is how they built their chatbot called Claude. But obviously, what goes into this constitution is going to have a huge effect on kind of user experience and the kind of applications of this tool, because it directly guides the behavior of the model. So that's saying what the model can't do, what the model can do, what it should kind of create preferences and prioritize in different scenarios. So what CIP and Anthropic collaborated to do was basically look at, can we use a kind of collective to collectively build and collectively source this constitution? And they did that. And Anthropic retrained an entire AI model. They retrained it and kind of trained it on this kind of publicly sourced and publicly created constitution, and then compared the two. And that's what you can read in that blog, is they kind of dive into the minutiae of what are the different behaviors that we see between kind of the constitution that was just developed by developers at Anthropic versus the constitution that was built by the public. So as you can see here, there really is kind of multiple different avenues you can take to incorporate collective intelligence processes into these kind of AI development pipelines. And this is some work we're going to continue doing at CIP, seeing where is this most effective to do, what different processes work in different areas, because, you know, in the participatory space as well, quite typically things would be broken down. You know, you have kind of things like polis and online digitization. You have things like citizens assemblies, deliberative polling, all of these different tools. And I think everyone recognizes they're generally useful for different things. But I think what we're really interested to see is, do we actually need maybe some kind of novel approaches to really make processes that are suitable for the kind of specific domain of AI? And especially as we're shifting away to new possibilities beyond just things like policymaking, although that is a really, really important area when it comes to this. And it's looking at actual like these specific kind of little areas of tech development. What would it look like to design participatory processes that are really useful and effective there? And so kind of just moving on, I'll give a little bit about the Recursive Public. So this was a project I did before I joined CIP. We've basically just wrapped up our work now. It was a collaboration that I did with some researchers from Chatham House, some folks from vTaiwan, which for those who aren't so familiar, essentially started about a decade ago in Taiwan. And it's essentially a kind of civil tech hacktivist group that aspire to make kind of good digital government and governance. And this wider community is called GovZero, and they developed this kind of collective and process called vTaiwan. And also some folks from the AI Objectives Institute, which is kind of based between the UK and the US, joined to help us explore a couple of different avenues. So this was funded by OpenAI as part of their democratic input grant scheme. So 10 teams from around the world got a grant to kind of design, build, and test some kind of novel approach to kind of participation in AI. And I will just add the disclaimer that it was only a 3-month project. So I think for anyone who's kind of run any kind of participatory process before might recognize 2 months is not that long to run something like this. So I think we didn't necessarily get to test everything we wanted to test, but I think we've definitely laid some really, really interesting foundations for future work. So really the problem statement that we were looking at here is this kind of one of the key issues that we see in participation in AI is essentially that this technology is evolving way faster than most governance frameworks, the government regulation can kind of keep up with. This tech is changing all the time. We're seeing new releases, new capabilities, and also we're just seeing new societal adoption and adaptation. This isn't just about new tech being built, but also kind of we're very quickly adapting as a society and as a workforce, as businesses, as education, etc., in our using of these tools. This is all moving so quickly. And so really we're thinking, how do we design participatory practices and approaches that can somehow maintain the same pace as these technological and societal shifts and can adapt as they need to make sure that the outputs and the processes are constantly maintaining relevance and power. You know, I think historically in lots of participation, things are kind of one issue, one audience, one process, one output. You choose a topic, you choose a selection of people, you run a process, be it a kind of digital consultation, be it a citizens assembly, be it a deliberative poll, and you produce one output. And in many cases, this is incredibly effective. And in some cases in AI, this might be suitable when it comes to kind of wider questions. But we are really interested in seeing what would it look like to design processes that kind of can enable pace and really kind of maintain relevance, influence, and power. So what is recursion? So we explored this idea a lot over the time that we're doing this project, and we've kind of come out with a few different points for how we kind of define recursion. So the first of that is dynamic issue surfacing. So this is looking at how can we create processes that continually address and prioritize different issues and different problems as they arise, rather than being tied to kind of a stagnant agenda. So this kind of takes many forms, not least of which is just having wide different audiences, different stakeholders involved in creating the agenda from the get-go. Number 2 would be process change mass participation. So what would it look like if you could create kind of participatory infrastructure that would allow interconnected and related deliberations? And so this means you could have many different audiences taking part, and some processes possibly come together, some mix, some allow cross comparison, and really trying to build this wider web and this wider infrastructure to hold participatory practices to kind of have these link change. And this links exactly to kind of the third one there, which is time fluid conversations. So this really comes at the question of, we're really interested to see what would it look like if you could take the outputs of one process and feed it into a follow-up process. Basically meaning that, say you run a process and you produce an output, but then a new technology comes out 3 months after that might make some aspects of that output now out of date or need updating, or something's missing, something is taking away. what would it look like if you can create outputs that are effective at the time of production, but can also really click into future processes in useful ways, maybe with different audiences, different stakeholders, different target audiences, whatever. But what would it look like if you can slot that in, which means the outcomes that we're producing, again, always remain current, always remain relevant, and always remain useful. And the last one is, again, within this kind of wider infrastructural question, what does it look like to make processes that are kind of adaptive for multiple audiences and multiple outputs? So why make this? I kind of touched on some of it already. But the first one, again, staying up to date with technological and social norm shifts. The second one would be kind of managing to create an archive of the AI debate. So say you manage to run multiple of these linked processes over time or within this infrastructure. Well, it means that 3 years down the line of running these processes, you can see what the current discussion is, what the current deliberation is, where there's high areas of contention, high areas of consensus. But also you can look 3 years back and think, when we were first running these, like this area was actually the most important. And wow, isn't that crazy? It's still the same. We haven't solved that problem. Or wow, isn't it crazy? You know, we felt like we overcame that problem quite quickly after, and that's not even relevant with the technology we have. And as the debate is moving so quickly, we also think this could be kind of an interesting way to kind of archive this. Another is that it's adaptable. Again, this question about making sure it's approachable for different target audiences, topics, etc. And it's democratized. You know, the processes, at least that we designed and we ran here, were quite simple by design. And the idea is that they're quite simple because we want to democratize the means of participation as well as access. So what would it look like if we can kind of spread the messaging and create, again, the framework and the infrastructure to allow lots of different people to run lots of different processes? And what would that look like? So the process, it was pretty inspired by the work of vTaiwan. So vTaiwan, as I mentioned, is this process coming out of this collective in Taiwan that was developed over a number of years. And it essentially is a hybrid process that mixes online participation with kind of face-to-face deliberation. And the idea is you bring in multiple different key stakeholders and you help them kind of refine and focus an issue. You tie them to kind of different avenues of power, be that government, be that kind of corporations. And they have this multi-stage process. And vTaiwan has been used many times with thousands, if not tens of thousands of citizens in Taiwan to overcome really contentious issues. Just one issue here, for example, was legislating around Uber. So like in many countries, Taiwan faced an issue when Uber became incredibly popular. And for example, taxi drivers felt that, you know, they were being undercut on prices. So they ran a process that had the government, it had riders, it had Uber drivers, it had taxi drivers, and it had all these different key stakeholder groups. And actually what was interesting is the conversation adapted kind of out of the original parameters. And really they found out that what most people cared about was Uber not paying kind of local tax rates. And the output of this was actually legislation put in place that meant Uber ended up leaving Taiwan. So it was really consequential. And the vTaiwan process, has kind of directly inspired the work of the Recursive Public. And so at its highest level, what does it look like? The processes we ran kind of look like this. So roughly 3 different stages. You set up an issue, you set up the process. So this is like identifying an issue, and this can either be by openly sourcing agenda items, it could be by feeding in key contentious issues. You make sure there's some kind of learning resources, some kind of access to information to make sure that there is an informed process and informed deliberation. This involves normally kind of getting input from experts in different areas. You make sure there's key stakeholders in the room. So what, again, that's an interesting question that we face is, who are the key stakeholders in these discussions around AI? It's quite easy when it's something like Uber because it's Uber drivers, taxi drivers, riders. What does it look like when it's kind of focusing on wider issues of AI? This leads to a digital consultation that is run using the tool Polis. And for people who might not be so aware of Polis, it is a tool that essentially came out of multiple different uprisings and basically the wish to create online platforms where people could collectively organize and prioritize and create consensus. And so you normally log into a Polis consultation, you're faced with multiple comments that have been put by your kind of fellow participants, and you vote either yes, like agree, disagree, or pass/unsure on these comments. And then you also have the opportunity to kind of add your own comments to the process. And what this means is that by the end of it, you manage to pull this kind of opinion matrix that kind of groups people depending on how they voted. So you see these kind of tribes, as it were, come out of this, and you can see how different groups voted. We then would take this data and analyze it in multiple different ways. And in the Recursive Public, one thing we're really interested in exploring was, what does the application of AI tools to deliberations look like? So I'll kind of touch on it in a sec, but we had a mix of kind of human and AI analysis. And then you have the optional, and this did happen with one of our publics, to feed this into a face-to-face consultation where you can kind of dive deeper into topics that were discussed. And essentially the way that this process works is rather than kind of having some vote on a yes, no, it works on consensus and kind of what you might call like super consensus. So items that had really high levels of consensus will be pulled forward to kind of some kind of final document, whereas the more divisive items, they'd be put aside. And so again, you could have like follow-up discussions on these divisive items is the kind of framework we're thinking. So we ran our process with 3 different primary publics. We had an international cohort of around 500 people who took part in multiple different digital consultations. We had a Taiwan cohort of around 230 people who took part in this kind of hybrid digital and face-to-face deliberation. And we had a youth cohort who were doing what I'm calling here an in-person digital consultation. So it was a group of around 300 young people who took part on Polis, but they were all together in one room as they did it. So I also think that adds an interesting dynamic of kind of the discussions that happen around the kind of final submissions. And again, all of these cohorts we really did aim to kind of have diverse cohorts in terms of different demographic kind of criteria and different backgrounds, but also different approaches, different views about AI and such. And we then, tested kind of what does it look like to analyze the outputs of these processes using 3 different ways. So we used the Polis analysis, we used human analysis, which aimed to kind of produce actionable recommendations from the outputs. And we also explored the application of AI. And so we specifically used a tool called Talk to the City, which is developed by the AI Objectives Institute. And we kind of pulled some opinion clustering, semantic mapping using this tool. And so really it uses multiple large language models to look at the actual language being used in these different statements. So rather, whereas Polis uses just kind of voting data, so you voted yes here, you voted pass here, you voted whatever, this actually looks at the language being used and it pulls out different language, makes different clusters. You can not just look at the voting groups that form, but actually the kind of cluster of opinion groups that form. And we think this opens up really interesting avenues for kind of contacting different groups or diving into different issues more. So for a brief look at those outputs, Polis, so just for anyone who hasn't used Polis before, this is kind of the report you naturally get. And so for example, we ran an agenda setting question with this international cohort. And you can see actually there's really generally quite high consensus. And there's an example of a very high consensus, might be the most high consensus point there, just about needing a diversity of voices in these conversations about AI. And then the more divisive statements lean more towards kind of the pursuit of superintelligence as a goal and kind of focusing on what you might call kind of existential risk. And so when we open this question of like, what should be the top of the agenda as we explore these questions, you could quite clearly start to see groups and different opinions form. And as you can see here, like, some of the very consensual items on the left, government should consider public investment. We need to foster better education and awareness about these, whereas the more divisive statements focus more on, the cost of democratizing and developing AI outweighs the benefits, or things are already too late and focus on existential stuff. So again, it was interesting that these fell quite neatly into 2 big camps in the kind of AI space of what you might call kind of near-term risk versus existential risk. In the Taiwan cohort, kind of similar things. This question that we asked the Taiwan cohort was actually about, should chatbots, for example, give different responses on questions depending on the cultural or contextual environments of the user? So for example, should a question about women's rights be answered differently in Riyadh compared to California? And you can kind of see different points coming out here about, there needs to be transparency in why things are coming out the way they are. And more divisive things were about saying, we should be able to use these things to make kind of offensive jokes. And when it led into the face-to-face, so this is where we really start to dive into the different key areas of the digital output, you could see they kind of widely went into these 3 different buckets. So focusing on data protection, bias and discrimination, and localization. So generally there was low consensus, for example, that maybe it even is possible to create global standards. So when we're looking at what value should be used, maybe it's impossible to actually choose some kind of global value. And maybe there's more high consensus that users should get the choice about whether they see outputs that might be contextually used, like based for them, or maybe they get lots of different contexts or things like this. And so it kind of, what we think is good about adding a second stage of deliberation is that it allows you to narrow in deeper and kind of follow the conversation and really see where it roots. And we asked kind of the same question to this youth cohort. And what was interesting here is that it very neatly divided into these 2 groups of kind of local context versus global values. So group A, you can see a lot of their answers are about, answers in very religious countries, AI tools should reflect the traditions in the answers that they give, compared to the global values group that focus more on, we shouldn't, support the rules and laws in authoritarian countries. So kind of we should ascribe to some kind of global values. In terms of the human output of this, we kind of took all of this data and we were thinking, if you were kind of a policy analyst, if you were kind of working on what would you really draw recommendations from this to people to do? And here's an example of what something like that could look like. And you can kind of see in the bottom left, we took some of the most divisive statements saying more processes should follow up on these. These are areas of really high division between these different groups. So you should kind of do these kind of follow-up processes, dive deeper into those and see why are they so divisive? Who are the key groups that we need to engage there? Let's dig deeper there. And on the kind of bottom right, you can see examples of actions and advice that would come from this. So much like CIP did with the kind of OpenAI outputs, we did the same thing here. So what would a policymaker audience maybe take from doing kind of these different kinds of consultations compared to OpenAI and industry? What different policies or different processes need to look like? And finally, I think the kind of most novel thing that we did in terms of output analysis in ours was we experimented with the application of AI. And so here is an example of a semantic clustering map. So again, this was using the international cohort's agenda setting polis. We drew all the data and we basically found that it fell into these large buckets. So as you can see, many of the questions focused on issues around AI and power in the red. That's kind of the biggest cluster. And lots of things were about what you might call focusing on egalitarianism and conservationism. Whereas issues around geopolitics down on the bottom left, or kind of eco-communitarianism up in the top right, in the pink, were much smaller. There were less. So this wasn't necessarily about, well, actually, so what this does is gives you this cool option that we kind of help build in. So these are kind of just all of the statements made, but then you can have kind of like sliding bar variables. And this will be in a report that's going to be coming out publicly soon, kind of I've just done it high level, diving a lot deeper into this thinking, but you can see kind of, okay, what's the minimum consensus? So we say we want 70% of all votes to have consensus. And that can either be disagree or agree, but then we want a minimum of 50 votes. So you can really play around and see like what were the most voted on issues, what were the most voted on issues with the highest amount of consensus, lowest amount of consensus, etc. So we really think incorporating some AI tools like this, so things like data analysis, really opens up some kind of avenues of exploration that we're really interested to continue. So in summary, before we absolutely jump to a question, because I've been speaking for like half an hour, next steps for the Recursive Public. So we really think what we've done is we've kind of laid the theoretical groundwork and done this kind of AI experimentation needed to really spur on some interesting thinking about what does it mean to make ongoing processes. And that kind of links to our second point, that I at least think to truly test the possibilities of Recursive Public, these interlinked wider frameworks, we do need a longer period of time. And so we plan on kind of building out our thinking more and maybe hopefully running more processes that would test the kind of interlinking of these processes and what role could things like AI play in what you might call that kind of recursive motor, like how does one process lead into another process, lead into another process. And so if anyone's interested in discussing about that, I would love that. It's something I'm incredibly interested in kind of exploring further. And next steps to CIP, we're going to be releasing very soon a publication that's looking at what have we learned from the work that's happened over the last year. And closer to the end of the year, we're going to be kind of laying out our roadmap for what we think we want to focus on, what we think the space might want to focus on kind of in 2024. And we're really going to be investing in R&D, experimentation, and kind of ecosystem building. So again, lots of these tricky questions. And, there's some of the questions here, like where does power lie in this space? So who should we really be focusing on? Is it government? Is it regulators? Is it the labs making these different technologies? What publics are needed in these deliberations? And so, for example, in most of the CIP processes so far, they've used representative samples of US publics. This is for multiple issues. And I think at its very easiest, it's very accessible to these labs to kind of wrap their heads around like representative sampling using US public. And again, I think what's most important isn't necessarily the processes that have been run so far, but more embedding the norm of participation into technological development at this really early stage. I think we have a really brilliant opportunity to build this right into these development pipelines right from the start. And I've no doubt the participation processes will get better, be more elaborate, and be more novel. And actually that will be able to produce more outcomes. But I think right now also there's an element of like simplicity being key. But again, how do we make sure these processes have teeth? you know, avoid like participation washing, tokenism. What does it look like to have mechanisms there? Does that need to go down a regulatory framework? Does that need to go down kind of really building this into the processes and policies of labs, etc.? And there's a million different things. What processes are good for different challenges? How can we balance good deliberation with like simplicity? And the many different questions that arise from participation more generally, balancing expert input with public input, especially with something as technically complex sometimes as AI and things like this. And so maybe just to wrap up, some of the learnings I've generally learned from doing this work is that AI labs, government bodies, and people thinking about these problems are generally very eager about this work. I think a lot of people see the value in it. And for example, one of the co-directors of CIP was on a panel discussion at the AI Safety Summit yesterday with Michelle Donnellan, who is the kind of the cabinet member of DCIT, the kind of department that holds all of the AI policy. And they're both on the Frontier Task Force, which is this kind of government body that is being turned into a new kind of research institution to really focus on these big questions. And so they're invited in because a lot of people see the value in this work. I think there's real possibility to have huge impacts in the way that we develop this technology, in the way we deploy this technology, making sure that this technology, you know, is for the collective good. There's many publics eager to take part in these conversations. For example, with the Recursive Public, that was all voluntary. And I'm sure maybe some people kind of, you know, took part in different aspects of that. There's no doubt, I've no doubt that engaging different publics in these processes moving forward is going to be incredibly easy. People have an eagerness to be involved, to have their voice heard, and to kind of really feel like they're playing a role in steering the kind of future of this technology. And last but not least, and this is more of, you know, I know that some people on this call have been thinking about this as well. There's this kind of second stream. So everything I've spoken about here is what applications could we have for collective intelligence in AI? But there's also this kind of counter stream of what applications could we have for AI in collective intelligence? And so I really think there is possibilities here. There's big philosophical questions about how much influence, power, inference, etc. you might want to hand over to machines over humans, especially when it comes to kind of the ways that we organize and make decisions. But in terms of things like data analysis, if we can prove that these, you know, they're not making huge mistakes, then actually you can really validate the answers and all these things. That seems like quite a simple approach. Things like translation, you know, having run a global deliberation process for 38 languages where we had to do manual translation, I can tell you, no one should do that if we can have technology that does it accurately, because it takes an insanely long time. That seems like a super simple application of AI tools. I think that could really overcome these barriers. And, you know, people like the likes of Stanford University, the kind of deliberative democracy lab, that are working on AI facilitation. Again, all these big questions about what different roles can technology play in, I think, especially helping us scale these collective intelligence processes. I think there's the classic trade-off of depth of participation versus numbers participating. You know, something like citizens assembly, we have really, we might call really deep participation, really deep deliberation, in-depth conversations, can normally only have around 150 people before the quality of that deliberation starts to break down. Whereas something like a polis consultation can have thousands, tens of thousands. There actually is a limit. They like know the exact number that you should reach before it starts to break down, but I don't know it. But, you know, that's quite shallow. You know, you get to vote, you get to put your voices out, but really in terms of really digging into those kind of deep value-based conversations, etc., there's limits. So could AI help us kind of take some of the amazing elements of things like citizens assemblies, for example, but scale to the level of kind of things like polis? So overall, there is generally just lots of questions, lots of interesting things to kind of think about and overcome, stuff I'm super excited about exploring more at collective intelligence projects and hopefully taking some of the learnings from these different projects. But yeah, I'll call it there. Sorry, that was actually went on for way longer than I thought, but I would love to hear everyone's thoughts and what people are thinking, if this makes sense, or if everyone's like, this is really stupid, that's also equally welcome. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Flynn. Thank you so much. There's so much there to unpack and absorb. I know there's a few people who joined halfway through, and thanks so much for joining. I know that timings and people are busy. It's a busy time. It's an intense time. So yeah, before we launch some questions and discussion, let's take a collective sort of breath in, I think, and just really land. And wow, there's a lot there. There's a lot there to and it's an ongoing discussion, as you say, and that's why I love the sort of metaphor of collective intelligence to be that sort of swarm or that murmuration of starlings that's constantly shifting in different directions, but it's this is the whole thing. It's live. There's no time limit. There's no end date, and that's why it's tough to sort of draw that line and take decisions at certain moments when, you know, we know that our decisions or our minds change about issues constantly. So it's like, where do we draw the line for the taking in like public's input for these really important decisions? But yeah, let me know anyone who's part of the who's joined recently or who's like on at the moment, and just honestly, any burning questions, any clarification points, just please raise your hand, or you can type it into the chat and I'll read it out for you. I've got loads of questions, otherwise I'll just go ahead. Oliver, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that, Flynn. That was there was a lot there and lots of good stuff as well. And no, don't apologize. It was all good. I'm really glad you mentioned the point about these methodologies potentially being performative when companies use them, because I think there is a risk of that. So I think it was good that you noted that. I was very interested in the extent to which, and you may have mentioned this, but there was a lot. So sorry if I missed it. The extent to which these techniques are really powerful for kind of more marginalized communities, because there's a whole kind of discourse on kind of community power and building community power in communities that have kind of not had power, have power to kind of taken away from them. And I'm really interested in kind of how that I'm not an expert in that, actually I know it a bit, but interested in kind of how that reads across to these techniques.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, it's a brilliant question, and it's definitely something that's like super important to consider. So I think there's a couple of things. I think one, there's the element that I personally would, so my kind of exclusive interest and focus isn't just like, hey, let's like get labs to sign up to a process and we run it and see what they do. You know, I'm really interested and generally, and you know, as Isabel was saying, I spent the last year at the Alan Turing Institute, but my background is kind of civic participation, and this is one of the big things I really care about, is how do we give voice to people who typically within our systems and structures like don't have that much voice, because as we know, we don't live in like a fair or equal society. So I think I'm really interested if we can get to the point generally with AI, but also with other stuff, where the normalization of like participatory processes really do allow kind of like groundswells and really promote communities to create, one, like community resilience within themselves through like collective organizing, but two, having open avenues and methods to kind of interact with other power holders and, you know, really push for action that they care about. And so I think there's a whole element there which is much wider and actually maybe even a more tricky question about kind of solving, you know, AI, about how do we like change society for the better. But there's a whole element there. I think it's a mix of like process building, movement building, and there's definitely just a wider piece about like activation, building agency in communities. And this won't just come from, you know, folks like me being like, hey, let's do some processes. It's a big whole systemic thing. But I also do think that one just easy access route is that a big part, at least in my belief, of running these processes, and if you do run these processes with kind of some of these kind of existing holders of power, be it government, be it labs, whatever, is just really making sure that these voices are in the room. So I think that's, you know, and again, this is like a wider question in the participation field, right? Do we go for kind of demographic representation to have wider legitimacy, or should we kind of put the focus on making sure groups who are most affected or most marginalized kind of really have presence in the room? And I think probably the answer is both, like different processes and different scenarios call for different things. But I think that is one really good thing. I mean, you know, it's no secret that most of the people building this technology are like, you know, folks based in America, normally university educated, you know, or there's different biases that really come in. They're mostly men. So I think really making sure that we have a diversity of voices in these discussions is a really key part of that, because, and that was kind of, and again, at the beginning, I listed out a couple of reasons why this is even important. And I think the second one I listed was that the folks building this technology right now can't see all of the kind of issues that might arise, can't see all the damage this might do to society. But that's not their fault. It's because no individual or small group could. And naturally, when you work also in an industry that, well, is dominated by certain folks, e.g. like engineers or tech people who might, again, have some kind of shared experience, naturally you kind of have some of those diversity of views or those blank spots. And like, I have blank spots, everyone has blank spots. So I think, how can we bring lots of voices in, definitely including those most affected and those kind of most marginalized from a lot of decision making, is like just of vital importance, basically. I hope that kind of answers it a bit. Oh, I think we've lost Bella, but Sammy, do you wanna hop in?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Yeah, thanks for that, Flynn. That was really great to hear about, yeah, the work you're doing at CIP and Recursive Public and all you've developed there. It looks amazing. So yeah, I was wondering, so you mentioned that different kinds of collective intelligence systems would be better suited for different points of leverage across like the AI pipeline. I think that's like a really important nuance here. I'm just wondering if you can give any examples or any initial thoughts and findings that you might have on this. So for example, like what might it make sense to have a global citizen assembly on, and what might make sense for maybe a more digital polis kind of conversation? Yeah, any thoughts on that would be great.
Yeah, no, again, a really good question. Something I don't have a clear answer to, something I definitely want to explore more in the next year and kind of beyond. I think for me, I guess there's multiple factors, but for example, one of the factors is, and again, I know I spoke about with Recursive Public stuff, we need most outputs maybe won't be static anymore, but I think some outputs will be a bit more static, and you might have more time and structure and more effort to put the time in with something like citizens assembly, for example, which is reasonably resource heavy in terms of just like, yes, money, but also like the time of participation needed and facilitators and all this different kind of stuff to produce some big outputs. And whereas something like, what you might say, like when you're training AI models, often a way that they are trained is something called reinforcement learning with human feedback. So this is essentially, models will display a behavior and a human will basically go like, yes, I like that behavior, or no, I don't like that behavior. So you could have like a robot trying to do a backflip, and you don't know how to code every single little tiny mechanism and spring within that robot to do the backflip. But when it does something, you can tell it that's a backflip or it's not. Or you can you could like a scale or something, say like, yeah, 10 is like a perfect backflip, 1 is terrible. And slowly it will start to learn, and this is what machine learning is, it starts to learn how to get closer to a backflip. Or a chatbot might give a response and you say like, I prefer this response to this response, or I think you missed this, or I don't, and this is what tends to happen kind of now, and sometimes things called like red teaming, which is, can we basically hire people to like break a model, make it behave in ways we don't want it to behave, like make it tell you how to make a bomb or something when we know that it shouldn't tell you that. So these kind of things that might not require so much deep deliberation, but maybe the key there is something like diversity in voices or just numbers participating. Maybe that's somewhere where you could use these slightly shallower but easier for mass participation processes. But again, this is me very much kind of reasonably stabbing in the dark at the moment, because I'm really curious to like do more experimentation and really see how these play out. And maybe, who knows, we might need way deeper deliberation things for more than we realize, or we might get really good at getting like really good outputs, like eliciting people's like real values and understanding through digital means in ways that we currently can't, and that therefore might sometimes be enough for more complex issues. So, and yeah, and I mean the global and multiple questions, and I don't have any answers, but it's all really interesting. But yeah, the like global versus the local, I think there's a big question there about, AI is intrinsically global because everyone is using it, and at the moment there's like fairly open access to lots of these tools. But there's a big question about like, like the question we were asking some of these publics, do we want AIs to behave differently, or should AIs be governed differently? So there's also these questions like, yeah, do we need a global citizens assembly because actually we've realized we need the voice of everyone in the world to kind of, take part in this conversation, versus actually this is something that maybe a certain public or a certain region or something could answer. So again, I think what I'm really interested in exploring more is laying out all of these different like dilemmas, problems, levels, and thinking, okay, like this participatory process might be really good here, but like might not be suitable here, but this could be really good here. And again, I think CIP are going to be building out our thinking and hopefully releasing something in December, hopefully, that might lay out some thinking around this. And we'll look forward to getting everyone's feedback on it. So no solid answers is my answer, sorry. Sorry, I know
Ben,
people had their hands up, but
that's right. Ben, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think there may have been Melissa potentially before me, but
Sorry, Melissa.
Sorry.
It's fine, Ben. You can go ahead and then I can go after.
Sorry, Melissa.
No worries. So yeah, my question was specific, bringing it around regards to the actual governance of AI, and of course the big question of governance is the enforcement aspect of it. So I'm wondering, like, developing these mechanisms, to what extent do you imagine them being applied? Is it again just reliant on the goodwill, so to speak, of the company that's enforcing it? I suppose on this you kind of get into the deeper issues of like the globe and how we govern ourselves. So I'm just wondering in terms of like how you'd envision the enforcement mechanisms working to do with the governance.
Yeah, again, super vital. And I think this is really, in my view, like the question in participation, in participatory practice of all elements. The collective we is like whatever, like a field or people who just like to think about this stuff. I think we're really good at running processes now. You know, we've really nailed in quite a lot of things about getting people engaged and getting really useful outcomes and overcoming polarization and doing all the amazing things that kind of deliberation can do. The piece I actually just don't see, and I would love other people on this call to like tell me I'm wrong, but is the clear route to like impact and power. I mean, again, it depends how you define impact. In terms of impact and kind of working towards reigniting citizenry and people wanting to be active in democracy, possibly hopefully playing a role in redefining what democracy might be, moving away from handing power away to representatives and, you know, being like active citizens ourselves and collectively governing. The narrative around things like citizens' assemblies have clearly captured the public imagination, I think, more than any other participatory process has. I think that's really brilliant in kind of reinvigorating that. And the people taking part, you know, often get this sense of agency and activation. And oh my God, you know, when we did the Global Assembly, the number of people who were emailing me and saying, I'm going to go set up a community resilience hub in my town. I'm going to go educate people about, you know, the climate and ecological crisis, who I know. That's really amazing. And don't get me wrong, that's like amazing. And like my dream is just to have like people really feel like they have a sense of agency and then they can really make change in society. That's like the overarching goal. But in terms of running processes and like holding like existing power centers accountable, that's like never really been overcome. You know, we look at like the Convention citoyenne pour le climat in France. You know, Macron kind of said, we're going to run the Citizen Assembly on climate change and we're going to take all of the outputs, put them to Parliament and like turn this all into legislation. And the outputs were actually probably just way more radical than they expected, and kind of not that much happened. They got completely diluted. And I think when it came to the members kind of voting, like, how do you vote on the government's response to your outcomes? It was like a 3 out of 10. Like they were like hugely dissatisfied with what the government did with it. But that's the government, you know, and so I think I am interested to explore whether that is different with someone like an AI lab. They are a private entity, and like some people might say, well, you shouldn't work on them. They've got like their adverse incentives, market competition, etc. And I think that's all true. They do have different incentives to government, but I don't think we've even necessarily proven that these processes, we haven't really, not proven, we haven't got it right exactly yet to really click these into change in something like government and public policy. And there has been exploration in interacting with private entities. But a big question, and the question might be no, like you shouldn't focus on private entities or you shouldn't focus on AI labs. But I don't think we've done quite enough experimenting yet to see if maybe it's different. You know, they're smaller bureaucratically, they're more agile, they're still making incredibly consequential decisions, but also there's like business sense for running these processes. You're going to get better user experience because you've got a diversity of voices building your tool. So it's not even just like the moral question. Also, there's probably like a liability question, like it's better, you know, we made a collective make these decisions than our like engineering team made it and then it told someone how to make a bomb. You know what I mean? Like it's these things. So there's like a market case, there's a moral case. And I think lots of these labs do have a genuine interest in like innovation. You know, it's the whole like move fast, break things, do things differently, think outside the box. So I think there's also a lot of openness to like genuinely investing time, money, and like process space to these things. So I don't know exactly what it looks like to kind of shift the incentives of government and corporations and everything to make sure these things really do have teeth. And I think there's people way smarter and way more experienced than me in this field who have been trying to tackle this problem for like the last 20 years. So I don't have like a clean answer, but it's like the big question, I would say, Ben. Like it's like the question for me. Like we can run really good processes, but how do we make sure like real change comes from that? And I think there's maybe a new opening here in terms of also not being like, hey, it's about like governance. We're like, what if we can frame it to these labs as like, we're just making better tech for you. Is that useful? And then before you know it, bam, like you require a citizens assembly every time you want to release a large language model. Not saying that's good, but like, you know what I mean? What does it look like to really, to build this in early and really see what that does in the kind of medium to long term?
Definitely. And I think what you were mentioning about, so AI is an opportunity, like a new technology kind of thing, that things that we might not have had in the past. So it'd be really interesting if that like provides a template for, you know, future iterations, might be technology, industries, etc. Be really interesting to see how that develops. So thanks very much for that. Cheers.
Thanks so much, Ben. And
we've lost Bella again, but Melissa, do you want to?
Yeah, no, actually, one of my questions was precisely what Ben just asked, and maybe just building on that. We do know, I'm a researcher in participatory and deliberative democracy, for those of you who do not, I don't know. And the things that we do know is that there are pathways for compliance, and those pathways usually call for institutionalization. So what I was missing a little bit in your presentation, Flynn, is where is the state here? Is it only at the end, at the kind of output kind of moment where it's supposed to take up recommendations, but then we rely exclusively on companies and labs' willingness to even open up these spaces? And I wonder whether AI has not really opened the eyes worldwide as to how fast and how dangerous also some technologies can be, and to what extent should companies even be running wild with this kind of experiments. And I was wondering, yeah, if you had thoughts on that, on how to use, whether maybe even to use this kind of participatory processes to bring in the state or not, and if not, why, and if yes, why and how. So that's one question. And then the second question, more connected especially with the recursive public, but also more generally, I wanted to know what would be the difference between this kind of recursive processes and more permanent bodies. You know, there are some folks calling for permanent citizens assemblies ruling or governing next to traditional representative democratic institutions. Would that not be a similar case? You would also have then bodies of people who are changing over time. So you have different mandates, but it's everyday citizens. And I was wondering what is specific to this kind of recursive model, and why is it more appropriate for something like AI than maybe a more permanent body? Thank you.
No, yeah, totally. Thank you so much. So yeah, first question about the government. No, super important. And the only reason I've really focused on like labs here is just because that's where most of the work that I'm involved with has gone so far. But I think there's a huge role for the state in terms of the future of AI. I think regulation, legislation are incredibly important. And I don't think, you know, we should hand any more power necessarily to these private companies. And definitely like private companies shouldn't be leading the way in kind of conversations about regulation and stuff, which some would say they might be now. So I definitely think there's a role for the state and for government in this conversation. And I definitely have hope that these kind of participatory practices could play a useful and effective role in that. Especially when it comes to, big things about, you know, problem identification, like when it comes to questions of regulation, what do people really care about being regulated? Like what harms do people really see as the important harms in society? What things do they really feel like are important in their everyday lives? And therefore, what should the government prioritize? And again, you reach the kind of classic problems that you reach with all kind of participatory practices that come to things around quite technical stuff like legislation or something, you know, the opinions of professionals who work in this space who have a deep understanding about regulatory frameworks compared to a public. And I think the mission in all participation is to find good ways to balance that, be that mixing of participation, be that just really brilliant like learning journeys, be that all these different aspects. But no, it's a great point, and rightly pointed out. But yeah, I 100% think it's not just like government doesn't matter now, it's all about the labs, let's do that. I think just what I'm interested in is there's lots of people working on the government side of stuff, and I feel like there's a lot of momentum around something like exploring this with private entities right now. And so just like speaking completely personally to my own intellectual intrigue, I'm interested in giving that a bit of energy and seeing where it goes. And if a year from now, like there's zero shift, and I'm like, no, I think like market incentives still drive these companies rather than like a moral incentive for this participatory practice, then maybe that's just like, cool, we tried it, it doesn't work. Let's really focus on like policy, public policy or something like this. So I definitely think all of them, and again, the examples I gave there for CIP were labs, but they've done work with the Taiwan government about Taiwan's approach to participation with Audrey Tang, who was the big contributor and kind of leader of the vTaiwan. They also did kind of experimented with some processes at the White House Summit for Democracy earlier last year, and on these other spaces. And again, CIP are actively involved in the UK's current approach to regulating AI. So there's multiple different actors, and I think just I'm interested in what feels like a new question for me personally about interacting with something like labs, but they're not the most important necessarily. And in terms of the permanent thing, it's a really good point. It's a super good point. And I'm a big fan of like permanent institutionalization of these processes. I think it's like a really big step towards legitimizing and normalizing participation in and I mean, I know that everyone in the participation space is like, Belgium, but like Belgium, it's like they've got permanent stuff and it's cool. And like there's good moves in Scotland towards making kind of recurring, kind of more permanent bodies. And I know that, great organizations like Iswe Foundation are, pushing for replacing the House of Lords here with a permanent citizens assembly. And I think institutionalization is incredibly important for like legitimacy wise and making sure that like, again, it links to that, like how to make sure things have teeth question. So I think that's really important. But how it's kind of different to the recursive public, I guess our thinking was more around recursion within like decentralized systems. So I guess that's kind of, so compared to, but and I also want to make sure, I want to make it clear that we did this work and it was really interesting, but also again, a year from now, we might be like, man, that thinking was like super out of date and really not that useful. And I'm hoping that when the report gets published, well, I hope not everyone hates it, but I'm imagining and I'm expecting some healthy criticism, and I really welcome it. So I think what the idea with recursion we're playing with is, what does it look like to set up, like, at least the way I visualize it is, what could it look like in a future where we have these semi-decentralized participatory frameworks that allow, lots of different processes to be run by lots of different people on lots of different topics, and how can we find ways to interlink that? And a weird example I gave that might make no sense is kind of like a Wikipedia. You could enter like a Wikipedia and you could say like, wow, here's this like central declaration made by Global Citizens Assembly, and here's all the agenda items, and you can follow through those agenda items and be like, oh, look, here's like different processes that are run in like Brazil and run in like China and like by these different audiences talking about this. And what would it look like if we could create ways, and possibly AI enhanced ways, to be like, pull the key messages out, that key groups, create cross comparison. And I think the idea of also maybe like rapid, more quick iteration compared to like a yearly thing. Anyway, I'm being told we've gone over time, which we absolutely have, so I'm going to stop there. But really good question, thank you. And I don't think I fully answered it, but I hope I answered it a bit.
Thanks so much, Melissa, and thanks so much, Flynn. Yeah, this is honestly just the start of the conversation. So even if we have to wrap up the webinar now, this conversation's only just begun. It's so great to have all of you joining and engaged. Thank you so much for your attention and for your questions. And Flynn, thank you so much for taking the time and going through all these multiple projects and different angles. It's not a job for one, it's a collective effort. So this is all a step in the right direction, and we're all part of this movement together. So thank you so much. If there are any other further questions or something springs to mind later today, next week, just please pop it in the WhatsApp group. We're all there. And yeah, really looking forward to the next session.
Yeah, if anybody's interested in the wider array of Democracy Network workshops, trainings, webinars, briefings, bulletins, and all the other sort of resources and stuff, maps and everything else that we have available, the support that we can offer to democracy organisations in the UK. You can sign up on the email. You'll receive an email in about half an hour or about 20 minutes for feedback on Flynn's presentation. No, joking. On this event, and yeah, more information there about how you can get involved and all that kind of stuff. And it's really great to see so many people in the WhatsApp chat. So let's continue those conversations there. Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks, Isabella and Flynn.
Thanks, everyone.